Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Shrink Think, which is our channel here on treatment errors and treating survivors of narcissistic and psychopathic abuse, which is sponsored by the Association for MPD and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment. I am Sandra Brown. I'm the president at the association and also the director over at the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction. And I'm joined today with our co-host, Chelli Pumphrey.
Hello, everybody. I am a licensed professional counselor and a board member and the author of Insight is 2020. And I'm happy to be here helping everybody learn more about this pathological love relationships and psychopathology.
Yes. So I guess I have to give like a rant warning. Today we are talking about, honest to God, my biggest pet peeve. And so if I sound testy, I'm giving myself permission on this one issue because everybody has a pet peeve. And when I looked at our show list of topics that we're going to do, every time I looked at this one, I could just feel my blood pressure going up. So what we're going to talk about today is why it isn't narcissistic abuse. And the show was created for professionals, for therapists, for clinicians in the mental health field. Although other people are free to, of course, watch it, our outreach is for education to therapists. And so I don't know how you feel about it. What has really bothered me is every week we see people saying narcissistic abuse expert, including therapists. And it makes me wonder if that can even be the case when they don't even know what this field really is called and why, other than for search engine optimization reasons, that we shouldn't be using narcissistic abuse. Most of us have been forced into it by what has happened out in the field, where bloggers are the ones that just made up this term. And then that's what it has become known by. And when we go to advertise our services or do SEO on our website or the books we produce, we are stuck with this damn name that is so clinically inaccurate, and so many therapists really think this is the name of the genre. And they don't know, I think, the history of their own genre or what the terminology and why the terminology of this was created. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I feel like we got locked into a corner with terms.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I get in that struggle too, where like you mentioned, like even advertising or marketing, I feel like I always have to say narcissistic abuse and pathological love relationships, because so many people don't know the accurate term of the pathological love relationship, and yet everybody flocks to narcissistic abuse. So I have to be in that. I have to use the big, broad, internet and clinically inappropriate term to catch people's attention. And I don't want to keep, just pushing that out there to the world, but it's like we're just kind of stuck because there has been such a huge amount of bloggers and coaches out there who are using that term. It's just taken over the internet.
Right. that don't
Yeah.
work in the psychology field, or not supposed to be working
Mm-hmm.
in the psychology field. I know it. I have 2 ebooks that I just published for therapists, and I used it in the title, narcissistic / psychopathic abuse, and then one was on trauma bonds and one was on common treatment errors. And what I do in the first part of the book is then to talk about the correct terminology, the clinical terminology of it. It gets them on the cover, marketing wise, but almost everything, I've begun to produce is to talk about this, that we should clinically know our own genre, and that we should linguistically sound different than bloggers. Um, and so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Actually, I have quite a few notes because there's some important parts of this, so I'm not going to be totally pretending to talk off the top of my head on this because I think it's really important. In the association has tried to keep their thumb on the pulse of this genre because we're the ones who have started the first professional association for this. And so we have felt necessary to really look at what is happening in the field development. And so much of course, what we have seen is that a lot of therapists have gotten their understanding about this genre from what we call STEs, survivors turned experts. And they haven't gotten really any of their own history of knowing what this field was about, or from what I can see, any of the 30 years of science that's been, building on it. And the reason this issue about this word narcissistic abuse is so problematic is that, as you said, the correct clinical terminology for it is pathological love relationships, or PLRs. And it was named that for a reason that I don't expect bloggers to know, care about, or ever reference correctly, because they're just out there on their website and selling their $5 ebook. I don't expect that, from them. But there was actually a reason why we created this terminology about using the word pathological. And it was because 30 years ago, when I started working in this field, there was no research, no books, no journal articles. This field did not exist. And when I started putting the theories and the concepts together to build a clinical, what I hoped was a clinical counseling genre, not a pop psychology, flash in the pan, was that I was trying to take concepts that the little bit of information that was out there and to piggyback off of whatever I could find in research that identified pathological partners, whatever I could find in the field that was developing assessments about pathological partners, and take the little bit of things that were out there and build off of that. And that's why, I ended up calling it pathological relationships. And so, and it was in my thinking, the field was created to bring awareness to the issue of the dangerousness of psychopathology and the relationships, and that and to make a differentiation between domestic violence and abusers, which are not always pathological. And so much of that research had been on situational abusers. And there, until Donald Dutton's work, he came in and started looking at pathological batterers. And actually, he's a violence researcher, and he came in to look at failure in batter intervention programs. And what he found was what made them fail, so that they were including pathological, abusers in that. And that he set out to separate abuser typologies, and he started studying personality disorder batterers, and he even used typologies. He named one borderline batterer, antisocial or psychopathic batterer. And the whole purpose of that was to differentiate and say, these are the most dangerous. These are the ones that fail batter intervention. These are the ones whose survivors have most risk. These are the ones that perpetrate more physical violence, more injuries, more lethalities, more everything. And shouldn't we know that? I mean, if we're working in the field of violence treatment or violence prevention, shouldn't we know who we really, really need to be concerned with? And so I forget when his work came out in research, it led to developing forensic kinds of assessments, and even into books. And so that was huge, because the domestic violence field has not cared about differentiating this. And that my focus was on differentiating relationships that were more different and dangerous. And they were dangerous because the partner had pathology, and Dutton had already done all that research. And he was already sort of referencing, the pathology as part of the dangerousness of that. And so, because the field really didn't exist, I'm trying to grab things that have reference to these partners being dangerous and having personality disorders. And so, I tried building, specifically off of some research. And then secondly is that along came assessments, dangerousness assessments, lethality assessments, and those assessments were designed to pick up on personality disordered behavior. And so now, we have someone who has identified the type of partner that's dangerous. Now we have assessments that capture the personality disorder behavior in assessments. And the part that was missing was to name those types of relationships. And so we ended up naming them, pathological love relationships, to build off of research, assessments. And, onto the scene, much like the way that the domestic violence field started, which was grassroots, survivors helping survivors. My books came out in 2005 and 2008, which are credited with launching this field and with this awareness, and that the survivors really took to that concept. And they, not having any kind of training, began explaining it in their own, vernacular, shall we say. And what it did was that it dismantled all of the credibility and the clinical associations that had been built with research, with assessment, and it is done. At the time, there was no way to know the damage and what it began undoing. And the very thing that these survivors said they needed, which was recognition, like in court, that this isn't just domestic violence, that this is so much more dangerous, that they wanted that differentiation to not just be, this is another domestic violence case. And by the very act, of using the word narcissistic abuse, they began dismantling the credibility and the clinical name of the very thing they needed, especially in court. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can talk about, that's my rant. Maybe you can talk a little bit about why, in the big scope of psychopathology, using the word narcissistic abuse cannot ever be clinically correct.
Well, narcissistic abuse, it's like they're trying to use this as this umbrella, kind of like you've talked about, of it, but it's only one, like that's one thing that somebody could have. And there's, we've got cluster B disorders for the therapists that are watching, that there's a lot of overlap in cluster B. That's why this is why these personalities are in a cluster, because you see overlap between narcissism, borderline, antisocial, and so if we just play with the narcissism, you may be missing or misdiagnosing somebody who is actually borderline or antisocial, and missing it all together. So that's not accurate. And that doesn't include psychopathy, which isn't personality disorder in cluster B at all. And that's what scares me even more is, when you're talking about narcissistic abuse and you're not even aware of psychopathy, and the lethality goes up so much with this kind of disorder. And I think so many people have no idea that, I mean, especially with that piece of the psychopathy, that plays into these pathological love relationships. So it's super important to be clinically appropriate and clear on what exactly is leading to this. And it is these different kinds of personality disorders, these cluster Bs, and the psychopathy that can lead to a pathological love relationship.
Right. And as cluster disorders, there is hardly ever narcissism only. And what else makes someone so dangerous is any other existing coexisting other mental health issues, with addictions, with bipolar, with whatever. And calling it narcissistic abuse has stripped away the focus of the broad range of psychopathology that we were trying to hone in on, for the court's understanding that over here, when we're talking about domestic violence, yeah, a lot of times you hear people talking about um, they have addiction problems, they are an untreated bipolar. We're talking about
Right.
episodic illnesses, where in psychopathology, if we actually know what we're talking about and get some training in psychopathology, what we are trying to express to the court and to the survivor for lethality education is that there's all these disorders that fall under psychopathology that are considered pervasive disorders.
Mm-hmm.
They are not episodic. They don't remit. They don't remit and activate and cycle through and come and go. That we want the courts to know, and survivors to know, that the dangerousness of this is because these are non-remitting disorders. And when we focus on one piece of narcissistic abuse and we take the word pathological, which is connected to the word psychopathology, which is what we're concerned about in lethality with these survivors and what the courts need to be concerned with, we have stripped away the whole reason narcissism is problematic. We have stripped it away from its own psychopathology. And, um, and then, of course, what it has done to survivor education. You know, maybe you can talk about what's happened to the understanding of MPD as a disorder. Survivors think they think every abuser is a narcissist
Mm-hmm.
because the STEs, the survivors turn experts out there, list these huge
Right.
lists of everything under the sun
Right.
that has nothing to do with that. And we've really gotten it's just horribly impacted survivor pathology education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also see therapists also like what concerns me is therapists have now also gotten tired of the overuse of narcissism. Everyone's ex is a narcissist and this narcissistic abuse. So I also see them dismissing it kind of in this backlash of that. And then we're missing it all. I mean, it's hard to spot half the time anyway, but then if you kind of come in clinically with that idea of, oh gosh, here's another woman with a narcissistic ex, then you have an extra layer of you're going to miss it. So yeah, I think it's just when people are getting miseducated or they read the checklists online, oh my, he cheated on me, or she lies all the time, or I'm being gaslit, and you just assume it's narcissism. And if you're educating yourself online, which is what so many of us do these days, and you go into your therapist and say, hey, I think my husband's a narcissist, um it kind of just keeps it down this path where your blinders are on, and you may be missing the fact that actually this isn't a narcissist. This is somebody who actually just has an active addiction and depression, and if that was treated, you might actually see a nice human being, and
Right.
there's not a personality disorder under it. Or vice versa, you might be having a narcissistic partner and have no idea they're a narcissist, when clinicians are not adequately trained to really spot this.
Right. Right. And because survivors have gotten most of their supposed understanding of this, from other survivors, um, they don't even use the word abuser anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Every person that lies, cheats, drinks, screams, is a narcissist. The poor domestic violence marketing is going to go down the tubes. because now it's assumed that every abuser, is a narcissist. And one of the things, again, going back 30 years and beginning this work, was did I ever think this would turn into a potential clinical counseling genre? No. I was just trying to figure this out, little bits at a time. But as I began to work on the theory and the treatment methods and all of that, I could see it becoming a genre. Now, I think, just like what you said, I think it's at risk of being a flash in the pan, and that other therapists poo-pooing the words narcissistic abuse we already know they roll their eyes. They don't know the science. Most probably the therapists that are listening to this haven't been through our training to know the stacks of science that does exist to make it a field. And so my hope had been that through the last 10 years of research that I've been doing and theory development and treatment development, that this would become a recognizable population within the traumatic stress studies field as pathological love relationships. I don't see Bessel van der Kolk ever showing up at our door now and saying, hey, you know what? Your population really is a trauma population. We should be highlighting that. He's never going to do it when we can't even use the correct clinical name, and that as therapists, we're out there saying narcissistic abuse and flying monkeys and gray and yellow rocks will never make it into the traumatic stress studies recognition. And then that word narcissistic abuse is going to be a 10-year hot topic, make the money you can thing, and then it'll be gone. And, who is going to suffer are the survivors who truly are and have been harmed by someone with psychopathology, because we have bastardized it and we have violated our own field that was supposed to be focused on what made these relationships different and dangerous, which was psychopathology. Right. And the word narcissistic abuse has stripped it, the focus and the accuracy away from the issue of psychopathology that this field, my work, had been built on. And so I'm a little pissed at that, because I just see it. I don't think it will be here in 10 years. I think that the survivors will always be here, but if we don't really catch hold of the science behind this and see this as a genre in trauma treatment, that it's going to be one of those hot marketing topics. I'm trying to think of one that was hot 10 years ago and is gone now. Imago therapy. I don't know, maybe that's still around, but it'll be something like that, Yeah. And the bigger issue, I've jumped all over our notes, but let's go to, because I do want to go over a couple of these. What I think 4. And so, so there was no way really to predict what that simple name change that was started by bloggers and that therapists decided that they knew something they themselves as clinical people didn't know, and latched on to that. But here are Here are some of the things that that simple name change from shifting away from the focus, especially for family courts, to narcissistic abuse. Here are a couple of things. Why don't you do a couple of the first ones?
So I'm trying to follow the notes here. So it removed its association with an entire field of psychology, and abnormal psychology is psychopathology, which is the very identifier we wanted to shine light on, the extreme risk of these relationships. And I'm reading this because this is important to be really clear on. And having kept it in abnormal psychology could have eventually helped to further impact family courts.
And instead, it distorted it as pop psychology, where anyone similar to a Melody Beatty and codependency are experts in a field of psychology they are untrained in. And it has now caused all abusers to be called narcissists, losing the very distinction they needed to be flagged as high risk and get different services for the survivor needs, and to reinforce to the court system a different high-risk category that has an evidence basis in assessments and violence research, which courts require to make changes in the family court system.
And they inaccurately assign all sorts of behaviors that are not associated with this distinct population, blurring the survivor's needed identification skills of pathological behavior. So survivors don't know the difference between borderline behaviors and psychopaths. They're simply all narcissists. This misidentification has made all abusers narcissists, and little recognition for the other disorders just as likely, if not more likely, to be traumatizing and even lethal.
And that's really what scares me, is that there are other types that are a lot more dangerous than narcissists. And cluster combinations. Of course, psychopathy is at the top, and most therapists are not getting trained in psychopathy. Or if you get an antisocial borderline, whew, you know, my worry is the potential dangerousness and lethality of this is slipping by.
Right.
So a whole field that was decades old and was finally making headway in family court for the argument of a distinction of high conflict relationship and its connection to pathological disorders and personality disorders and psychopathy, which was some of the work that Dutton had done and differentiating the types. We have pathological abusers, and Bill Eddy had gotten the go-ahead from a family one court system to start a separate path, if you will, for those that were pathologically, one of the partners was pathologically disordered and were in custody court. And he created a program based on their psychopathology. And so we had this thing building. We had research from Dutton. We had dangerousness assessments. And then we had Eddy's core program, which is now collapsing under the miseducation of these experts that has infected the work that was happening over the years in specific education in the courts. The field had gotten a pilot program, that's Eddy's program, that the courts allowed for a different path in court for those cases in which one person had a personality disorder. And now we are regressing.
Yeah.
Consequently, it's many survivors' perceptions, and we've talked about this, that any kind of abuse is now narcissistic abuse. So what Dutton had started in the late 80s and early 90s, then the dangerousness assessments that came in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and then I came, identifying and marrying those concepts together is now collapsing.
Yeah. So
So,
scary.
yeah, it is scary, and that this is the exact distinction that so many of these survivors need for court,
Yes.
or else it just gets labeled high conflict, and there's
Right.
no focus on the psychopathology that is in every high conflict case,
Yeah.
I would say, and that is the lethality and litigious element of court. So I just depressed myself. I could cry now that
I feel the same.
we looked at all
Oh.
this. Oh, I knew this was going to get me going.
Yeah.
And we jumped through some material because we try to keep these kind of quick. But anyway, um, if this rings any bells and whistles, please go over to the association website at survivortreatment.com. We offer core competency training specifically in pathological relationships that can actually lead to certification with real science and no flying monkeys.
Yeah.
So hope you'll stop by at survivortreatment.com, and I'm going to go take my Prozac. So
Same. Bye.